guys, we're going to start. Hello. I'm Alexis Lowry Murray, and I'm the curator of the Bell Gallery. And I want to start off by welcoming you all here to our first event of the 2014-2015 academic year. We are really excited about this year because not only do we have this great sound show, but we also have another series of wonderful exhibitions coming up. In October, we have a show called She, Victor Newton's Return to the 21st Century, which will feature work by Jenny Saville, Lisa Yuskevich, George Carmel, Jeff Koons, and a whole bunch of other people. And many of them will be coming to speak. We hope to see you guys back here for that. And then we're hosting the National Council for Education on Ceramic Arts' annual or biennial jury exhibition, which will also be a really wonderful show. And we will end the activity here in the spring with a solo show of sculptor and ground-long music work. So we have a great lineup, and we are excited to see you all here all year. Following this conversation, there's going to be a reception here, but I also want to alert you to the fact that the reception will also be happening at the Granoff Center in the Cohen Gallery. So you guys can split your time however you like, but I hope you need it to both ends. I'm going to introduce all of our artists and our wonderful moderator at first, and then I'll let them come up on their own, so I don't interrupt. But I'll start with Surui Abdalian, who's an open-based artist who experiments with the limits of perception through site-specific interventions. Since graduating from the California College of Art in 2010, she's produced numerous site-specific installations that challenge sensorial expectations while gesturing towards the social, political, and functional identity of the given space. Having been held under sway, her contribution to the 12th Istanbul Biennial used tactile transducers to, quote, transmit infrasonic test tones, tones that generally fall below the threshold of hearing, but which are felt physically. Her 2013 exhibition at the Berkeley Art Museum similarly subverted expectations. As a demonstration, the continuously ringing bell enclosed in a vacuum chamber, which was a clear sealed vacuum container, which was placed beside each envelope as before, a black table-like structure that appeared static but was in fact emitting sounds that substituted for the silently ringing bells. Abdalian's sounding and silent objects evoked the Berkeley Art Museum's history as a hotbed for social and political activism in that tension between sound and silence. She's participated in numerous national and international exhibitions, including solo shows at the Berkeley Art Museum, Altman Siegel Gallery in San Francisco, and international biennials such as the 12th Istanbul Biennial, the Shanghai Biennial, Reactivation, and the 8th Berlin Biennial, which she's just come back from. She was also the 2012 recipient of SF MoMA's SICA Award for Emerging Artists. So the next artist that will speak after Surui are actually two. The User is a Montreal-based collective made up of Thomas McIntosh and Emmanuel Madan. Emmanuel is a composer, an installation artist, and Thomas is trained as an architect. They've been collaborating together and exploring the relationship between technology and contemporary culture through sound installation since 1997. Their 1998 Symphony for Dot Matrix repurposed 15 dot matrix printers, now a sort of obsolete office technology, into musical instruments by harnessing the laborious sounds of each printer's head movements. In a way, the work evoked early graphic notational experiments by artists such as Earl Brown and Christian Wolff. Computers connected to an area network sent text scores to print, substituting the signs and symbols of
musical notation with those of the written word, which then became, quote, the textures, tones, and rhythms of the music. In 2000, they transformed an abandoned grain elevator into the port of Old Montreal into a permanent public instrument, playable via internet and telephone, and I encourage you all to go online and play with it. It's fabulous. Xylophone allows participants to call or send found or original sound files into the building's resonant concrete chamber and is accessible to anyone with access to a phone or computer. In 2008, they also began work on the series of coincidence engines, and we are showing there first, so I won't talk that much about it, but have a look and read all about it in our brochure. They're the recipients of numerous awards and distinctions, such as the Telefilm Canada Prize, the first prize in the performance section of the Montreal International Festival of New Cinema and New Media, and they were also nominated for Nam June Paik Prize in 2004, and their work has been installed and performed at museums and festivals across the world. Finally, Tristan Perrick is a composer and sound artist based in New York. He studied math, music, and computer science at Columbia University and holds a master's degree in interactive telecommunications, the Interactive Telecommunications program at New York University's Tisch School of Art. He's fascinated by, quote, the aesthetics of code, and he explores the visual manifestations of one-bit music and one-bit technology, I should say, in all of his work. His first album, One Bit Music, was released in 2004-2005, and it was followed in 2009-10 with One Bit Symphony, which you can hear at the Granoff Center. Both further experimented with the possibility of using basic coding to create complex compositional structures. In the spirit of Jean Tinguely, his metamechanics, and Nam June Paik's magnet TVs, Perrick has deployed one-bit technology to create machine drawings that are programmed to embrace chance and videos that use binary code to manipulate cathode rays. Likewise, the microtonal wall installed at the Cohen Gallery uses binary code to create an enveloping sonic environment, which not only exposes the microtonal range of one-bit sound, but also highlights the inherently relational nature of listening. Perrick's work has been exhibited widely in the United States and abroad. He's participated in group shows at the Museum of Modern Art, Das Weisshaus in Vienna, Interaccess Electronic Media Arts in Toronto, and Box Gallery in Copenhagen. And he's held solo shows at Bitforms in New York, the Katona Museum of Art in Katona, and Issues Project Room, among many other places. Finally, I want to introduce visual arts professor extraordinaire at Osborne, who has kindly agreed to moderate this conversation at the very beginning of the semester, his most hectic time, I'm sure. Ed works with many forms of electronic media, including installation, video, and performance, and sound. Interested in the dynamic relationship between sound and space, he works to, quote, convey a tactile sense of space, movement, image, orality combined with a precise economy of means. And it's this economy of means that I think makes him particularly suited to speak with our artists today, who also all exercise an extraordinary economy of means to achieve really complex things. He's received grants from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Creative Work Fund, Arts International, and has been awarded residencies at DAD, Artists in Berlin program, the Banff Center for the Arts, Het Apollohuis, I should have practiced pronouncing that one, in the Netherlands, and STIME in Amsterdam, among other places. And his work has been presented at museums and galleries around the world, including SF MoMA, the Berkeley Art Museum, ZKM in Karlsruhe, Germany, Mass MoCA in North Adams, and Art Space in Sydney, Australia. Excitingly, he also taught at the California College of Arts, which is Zaroui's alma mater, so I feel there's a great full circle. So, without boring you too much, without further ado, here they are.
Isn't it?
Was your computer working before?
Mm-hmm.
Take the resolution down on your screen. Can you take the resolution down on
What's
your
that?
screen? Switch the resolution.
Yeah, she said it was working before, so I don't know. Oh, it's not reading the, it's not reading
Just
the
try it
dongle.
again.
Switch toggle. That's a good start. This is gonna work. There we go.
All right. Can y'all hear me? Okay. So what I thought I'd do, rather than speak about the work that's here at Brown, is to speak about some former projects that I think offer some context to the work presented here. I make sculptures and installations that often respond to the specific attributes of a given location, architectural setting, or social landscape. Though working with site or context specifically, I often choose to focus on exactly those features of a site that are encountered elsewhere in the everyday experiences of the spectator. I've thus initiated projects on the basis of mere cracks in a cement floor, a derelict cafe, a shop window, or even that most generic feature of an exhibition space, the white walls of the gallery. I typically use modest materials to produce sometimes subtle, conceptual, or formal effects that stage an alteration or a shift of perception within the immediate environment. The materials I use vary between projects and have included plastics, measuring devices, text and signage, utilitarian lights, a garden decoy, and as here, amplified sound. The first, I'm going to show you 4 projects that have been chosen because they employ sound in some way. And the first is Having Been Held Under This Way. This work was commissioned for the 2011 Istanbul Biennial. And knowing that I was making a site-specific piece for Istanbul, I set to create out a work that embodied the ruptures and veneers of Turkey's telling of its history and representation of its current conflicts. That is, I meant to make a work that would be at once undeniably present and yet obscured. So in this installation, infrasonic sine waves, which are really low frequencies that one feels in the body rather than hears, and there's not sound working, so y'all can work on that maybe. So anyways, these really low frequencies in the room articulated the physical materials of that space. The sound waves cause stress on the drywall and studs of the room in which the work exists, and the stress and movement of these materials are all that's ultimately audible.
Coming out of the computer.
The sound's on, so
There's no sound coming out of anything.
I know. Well, we'll just do it without sound. Who needs sound? And it's just documentation anyway, so.
I think it was working, it was just quiet.
Oh, you turned it down for Tristan?
I heard it rumbling.
Okay, thank you. Okay. So there was a rumbling in the piece. The sound waves stress the drywall and the materials of the space, and the stress and movement of the materials is what's audible in the space, rather than anything coming from the transducers that I used. The only other component of this work is a plumb bob that in this instance functions to register the perturbation of the walls and to respond even as its conventional use is compromised in doing so. So it's swaying back and forth. More recent works, this is supposed to come next. More recent works similarly use an unremarkable signal to articulate physical features of a space, which might be an architectural space or a space created in the context of a sculpture. In each envelope as before, this work is part of a series of related sculptures that were presented in 2013 at the Berkeley Art Museum. And in this work, a shiny black acrylic vitrine sits atop a metal frame. Though the interior of the vitrine is unavailable and unseen, the viewer is acutely tuned to its parameters, as solenoid pins located inside the opaque container tap a rhythm that is not quite regular, articulating this space within the vitrine and also resonating throughout the floors of the entire museum. Sorry, I didn't order these. Okay. Occasional Music was a 5-month-long public installation in downtown Oakland, California. This work consists of brass bells that simultaneously ring from rooftops radiating out from Oscar Grant Plaza. Activated for several minutes once a day at a randomly predetermined time, each bell plays a unique but strictly coordinated series of accelerandos and retardandos, in effect sounding a chorus of bells, distinct to each day of its installation. In both Each Envelope as Before and Occasional Music, an impulse registers within and against the materials that form the work. In Each Envelope as Before, the materials comprise a sculpture within a gallery. In Occasional Music, the space is that of the city and the myriad occlusions that occur and characterize it. Occasional music takes place in the present, is different each day, and is experienced variously according to the viewer's position and movement through the space, much as the work installed in the Bell Gallery. In randomizing the activation of the ringing throughout the day, I mean for the signals to hail a range of auditors, some of whom are engaged in activities other than evaluating artwork, and some who have shown up for that express purpose. As a demonstration was presented alongside and in contrast to Each Envelope as before, and this exhibition occurred at the same time as Occasional Music. And as a demonstration, sound waves are audible because of, sound waves are inaudible because of the material components or lack thereof in this instance, in the piece. In order to be heard, sound needs a medium to travel through, and within the near vacuum conditions of an acrylic chamber, the air has almost no material. This apparatus and setup is probably familiar from physics lab, but here the arrangement is presented in the context of a museum and in the context of other artworks. Thus, and as a demonstration, the bell's sound, or rather the very air through which it travels, is attenuated by a component of the museum's apparatus, the vitrine, as a vacuum chamber here. The last work I will mention from this same series is Ad libitum, If I Had a Hammer. The materials of this work, bone saddles, a tuner, and a brass wire, could all be used to form an instrument whose body, in this case, is the wall of a museum. In this sculpture, the wire is divided into intervals, and these intervals express the pitches that comprise Pete Seeger and Lee Hayes' song, If I Had a Hammer. The title of this piece and the others in this series, as a demonstration, each envelope as before, as well as the work here at Brown, which is titled In Unison, function as both direction and description in the way that dynamic markings, such as cambrio or staccato in music, might function. However, in this case, the work is mute and not played, and like a museum wall text, is experienced by reading. This piece makes a distinction between the solitary and the social, while it operates according to the rules of the museum. Objects are off limits and not to be touched, and museum objects still address the disinterested spectator. In these installations involving sound, I'm specifically focused on the acoustic properties of space. In other words, I'm concerned more with the response of a space than with the purposefully unremarkable impulse that excites it. Through these and other sculptures and installations, my work addresses the dynamics established between spectators and sites. My aim is to generalize the effect of defamiliarization produced at the site of the work so that the viewer might more readily recall in the commonplace, the strangeness that is proposed by the artwork.
We're all searching for something. Did we get any message?
So Thomas and I are the two members of the user. We formed in 1997. We're based in Montreal, and our projects began with sort of an inquiry into obsolescence as a case study for changing relationships between technologies and the people who use them.
And I should say before that the user is numbered. So this is user 1, and because we're of course numbered binary system, after the binary system I am user 0. So our background is, mine is in architecture, and I'm also an installation artist, and Emmanuel has background in composition, in electronic music, and I guess you're also an installation artist.
Indeed.
Yes, we are both installation artists.
So an early piece that we worked on about 15 years ago now involved appropriating an environment, the technological environment of the late 1990s office, and essentially the piece is called Symphony for Dot Matrix Printers, and it consists of assembling a very plausible set of technological equipment, namely a bunch of PCs and printers and the network technology that's needed to get them to communicate. But what we do is we repurpose these instruments and cause them to do something other than their usual purpose. So instead of being engaged in office work, what they're doing is they're making music. So they're reading from a collection of ASCII text files that we've composed in advance, and that we've composed very deliberately to musical effect. So we're using alphanumeric characters and other ASCII characters to generate sounds. And the work stems from a careful listening to what printers sound like and the kinds of sounds that you can get out of them when you cease to print functional texts, literary or otherwise sort of utilitarian text, and instead just work with the sound that is produced when you print a text, and it gradually evolves into a musical piece. So the first iterations of the piece were performances, symphonies number 1 and 2 for dot matrix printers. This is symphony number 2. There's, you don't see them here, but there are, in addition to the machines themselves, there are microphones that are amplifying the sound, and there are also cameras that are fitted into the mechanisms and to create close-ups that an audience can see so that you can establish a link between the movements of the printers and the sounds that result. We then went on to make a couple of installation versions of the work. This is called the Office Suite. It premiered in 2002 at a gallery in Pittsburgh. And the next one is called Quartet for Dot Matrix Printers, which was shown first in Dortmund in 2004 and has been played in a number of venues since then. We've got a little clip from Quartet for Dot Matrix Printers that explains the That is Symphony for Dot Matrix Printers. The next project we worked on together is called Xylophone. Thomas is going to talk about that.
So Xylophone is a project that came out of my thesis work at university, and it involves the silo number 5 grain elevator in Montreal, which is a grain transposition facility, storage and transposition facility, which was used to house grain that was grown in the prairies temporarily before it was put onto cargo vessels bound for mostly for Europe and the European market. And it was abandoned in 1995 and is a source of inspiration and fascination and obsession for the architectural community in Montreal because it's right downtown, and this is actually the last of the great silos that are left. Silo number 5, there are of course 1 through 4 and even 6, I think. And this is the last one which exists downtown in the city. The others have been demolished. So we got inside the building and started exploring it and discovered that there is a fantastic acoustic in the inside of the buildings, inside these cylinders, which are 100 feet high by 25 feet wide. Which comprise which make up the structure of the storage facility. So rather than recording music inside these fantastic spaces, which are sort of on par with the Taj Mahal and St. Paul's Cathedral in terms of their resonance time, we decided that the most interesting thing that we could do with these things was actually to share the space with the outside world, because you're not allowed to go into the building. Normally it's too complicated for insurance reasons and all the rest of that stuff. So what we did was we transformed the building itself into a public instrument to which you can send sounds either by telephone or by the internet or by through the use of this installation that we built in front of the building. So you speak into a microphone in this installation, your voice is broadcast inside the chamber, it resonates, is transformed, and comes back to you over the loudspeakers here, or is streamed back to you over the web or via the telephone, and you can hear the result of your sort of test of this acoustic environment at a distance without actually going inside the building. So this project still exists. It's a bit rickety at the moment. The technology dates back to 2000, and web projects don't usually last more than 6 months, and this one has been going since 1999. So we'll move on to more recent projects, which the series, one of which we're presenting here. This is an homage to György Ligeti, the Hungarian composer who died in 2006. And he was one of the main references for the Dot Matrix Printer Symphony that we created, because he was one of the first to actually treat sounds in a concrete fashion, sort of non-musical sounds, and use them for musical ends. And his piece, Poème Symphonique, is a composition for 100 metronomes, which are on stage. And you want to talk about that?
This is a staging of the work that we did in The Hague a few years ago. The 100 metronomes are set to different speeds. They're all set going, and the piece is over when the last metronome has ceased to tick because the spring is wound down. So our version, our homage to this piece, involves the clocks that you probably noticed on your way in. There are about 1,200 of them, and it's a very similar concept. We set them all to exactly the same time, and then they just tick. And the piece is nominally over when the last clock has run out of batteries. Unfortunately, we haven't actually staged a version of the work that lasts that long. It usually takes about 10 months, depending on the strength of your battery. I mean, we won't talk about this piece too much. You can experience it for yourself. But Coincidence Engines is actually a series. So the one outside is Coincidence Engine 1. And here are a few images of Coincidence Engine 2, which is a composition for the same clocks to begin with. They've been electronically modified so that rather than ticking of their own accord, they tick on command. So they don't listen to their internal quartz crystal. They respond to a signal that is sent by a sort of pretty elaborate electronic system that essentially exists as a support for a composition, an audiovisual composition. Short excerpt of that video here. And for that piece, we return to Ligeti's metronomes, actually. But here again, they're electronically modified so that they can do things like change the height of the adjustable weight without anybody touching them. There's a little motor that enables that. And there are also sensors, audio sensors, that allow the metronome to allow this little microcontroller brain to know what the tempo of the metronome is at any given time, as well as the tempo of the metronome's neighbors. So basically, it's like a distributed intelligence of these little metronomes that listen to one another and arrive at consensus, rhythmic consensus, if you will. This is some shots of the assembly of the work, and a short sort of proof of concept prototype. So here they're set off, and they're obviously running all at the same speed. Within a relatively short time, they achieve synchronization, but it's possible to instruct the metronome not necessarily to arrive at perfect sync, but to strive for sort of more complex simple rhythmic ratios to get these things to jam together.
And then a very quick run through of one of the last projects that we worked on, which is a very different kind of project. This is called Portrait Landscape Machine, and it is consists of a giant three-dimensional printer, back to the printers, but this time one that we fabricated ourselves. So it's a 3D printer that prints in Russian constructive manner only. No, that's not true. It prints in sand, using water as the only binder, so that we can actually reproduce a sort of sandcastle version of portraits of the public. It's conceived as a public artwork. So this was one of the initial tests that we made. And this person's name is Frank. Never met Frank, but we got Frank's face in 3D scan to before 3D scanning was really easy to get your hands on. And then we printed Frank in sand, and this is Frank.
scale? The scale of the work is about 2 foot by 4 foot or something like that.
Thank you very much.
Not this problem again. There we go. Hey, everybody. Thanks, Alexis, for having me here and for including my work in this wonderful exhibition. I like to start my talks often with this image, although if you could kind of pretend that I'm not there, because it illustrates sort of this core principle that my work is exploring. Basically the intersection between the physical world around us, the piano, obviously, and the abstract world of computation, of electronics. I grew up playing the piano. I love this instrument because it makes you think so much about sound, the physicality of sound. The idea that when you press a key, it's this lever mechanism that strikes a string, and there's a string or multiple strings for every single pitch. And so it's this kind of ridiculously overwrought instrument that is very heavy and is really just designed to embody the sound that it creates very physically. And the electronic audio speaker, just this raw speaker cone on the left side, which is the interface that we listen to music, recorded music or electronic music, mediated by this speaker that kind of acts as this weird membrane between this digital information or analog electronic signal, right, that music is played back via, and the world around us. It converts it to movement and into sound that we hear. So I want to just play an excerpt of this piece of mine called One Bit Symphony. It's an album, a composition for Microchip, basically, that was released like you see it. In a CD case, a complete circuit, and when you plug your headphones into the side and turn it on by flicking this little power switch inside the case, it plays back this sort of 45-minute, sort of never-ending piece of music. And just to play you a little bit of the beginning, it sounds like this. So the one bit that's in this title, One Bit Symphony, refers to the fact that the music that you're listening to consists entirely of one-bit audio waveform. That is to say, on and off pulses of electricity, these the ones and zeros of digital information, binary true-false signals that are outputted directly from this microchip through a volume knob into the headphone jack, and they connect to the speakers in your headphones, and essentially those ones and zeros of information become movement of the speaker membrane, and that translates into sound. So it's this very kind of primitive connection between, a very direct connection between code executing on a microchip via the laws of physics and outputting binary pulses of electricity, electric voltage potentials, which essentially turn into sound by your speakers in your headphones or a sound system or whatever. And actually, my background is in composition as well. I was very anti-electronic sound for a long time. I think mostly because I was really drawn to the physicality of classical instruments. I really loved the mechanism of how they create sound, like bowing the string of a violin, setting into vibration, being amplified by the body of the instrument, and we hear that as the character of that instrument, and same for the piano, same for wind instruments, etc. And I found that electronic sound didn't necessarily have this tangible aspect to it. And that changed a lot for me when I started working with electronics, these microprocessors that you saw in One Bit Symphony, these basic electronic chips, which are essentially raw computation. You write software, you download it onto the chip, and essentially it's like an open book. The input and output pins can read and write ones and zeros, and you can connect those maybe to a light or to a motor or to a speaker, and essentially whatever you program the chip to output becomes your raw material. And that kind of made computation into this process that was more physical for me. It started to live more in the world of mechanics and the physical world than the abstract world of mathematics. Computation basically bridges mathematics and the physical world in what I think is a really elegant way. And I started to explore that then in my classical music, basically bringing this basic electronic system, this one-bit electronic sound, onto the stage through these simple speaker magnets, speaker cones, combined with classical instrumentation, and exploring that in pieces like one for harpsichord or string quartet or accordions, solo cello, etc. This piece, Parallels, will be performed next Friday by me and Perkins Duo for tuned triangles, hi-hats, and 4-channel one-bit electronics. Vibraphone. So basically like thinking about the mechanism by which all these different instruments make sound, and seeing how that relates with sound basically coming from computation. And that led me to think more about process in general. I think that writing code to output sound made me realize that these processes in the code are not necessarily wedded to sound, that there was something more general that I was interested in. And it led me to start doing mechanical drawings, drawings made by machine, ink on paper or ink on wall, with a very, very simple mechanical apparatus, just these two motors connected to the same kind of microchip that I use in my music. And by keeping the system very, very simple, it allowed me to kind of focus on this basic interaction between the code, which is very rote and very absolute, and the physical world, which has texture, and you can't make a perfectly straight line in the physical world. There's the texture of the paper gets in the way, the jiggle of the lines of the motors and everything. So these pieces are kind of like this combination between code and the act of drawing. This led me to think about one-bit signals in video, and so I started doing these video installations, which then made me think about dance, human beings in the same space as televisions, sort of like musicians in the same space as speakers. I'm just touching upon these quickly just to get through this. And then I started working with this sound, but in a very, very kind of austere way, almost scientific way. This is a series of pieces called interval studies, which are grids of speakers which each emit individual unchanging frequencies of sound, but they're specifically tuned to range over a certain interval. Like the one on the left divides a half step into 49 individual frequencies, and the one on the right is a perfect fourth. And so when you approach these pieces, you hear the totality of these frequencies, and then when you get closer and closer, you zoom in on the sound and breaking down that full spectrum of pitch into individual pitches, basically. And that led to the piece that's on view here, Microtonal Wall, which has 1,500 speakers, which basically span 4 octaves of frequency, audible frequencies. And the experience of this piece is essentially one of hearing white noise when you first enter. The sum of 4 octaves of sound, 1,500 individual pitches. We know that white noise, like white light, is the sum of all frequencies. So this is sort of a gesture towards white noise without actually getting there. And then as you navigate closer to the piece, it kind of zooms in, and you can put your ear up to an individual speaker and hear that speaker's contribution to this massive sound. So you'll have to go over there to hear that. Cool. Thank you. Oh, I should say that Nick Schifrin is in the audience. He was one of the people who built Microtonal Wall with me. So, thanks, Nick.
So, thanks for those informative and I think just perfectly timed presentations. It was just enough to keep all the ideas, make them all present, and not dwell on them too long, so we can have a good conversation. I wanted to start out by asking each of you to talk about the relationship between sound as a physical material and then one that serves as a signifier in your work, because that process happens in varying degrees in your work and also within the range of pieces that you talked about. And it's a particularly interesting aspect of sound to me, but I'll save that part for later. So.
Good question.
Yeah.
Sure. I'm not exactly sure. I think I tend to think of them maybe as one and the same. That sound just is what it is. It's the movement of air. It's our ears hearing that as pitch or other kind of timbre. So I'm not exactly sure what to say, except that I think it's when I try to think of them as the same thing that's kind of what's maybe most interesting to me. I don't know if I'm sort of sidestepping the question by that, saying that. Sorry.
Sure. So I guess I talked about it a little bit, but my interest in sound is really as it affects materials at a site. So the impulse or signal is less important to me than what happens within a space and what's received by the auditor within that space. And I'm not really interested in sound as it might, say, like represent some other space and placing it in another location. But more it's the effects of this relatively simple signal generally on a space. So a bell, sort of useful in the bell piece is a very utilitarian tool used to create the piece within a specific context, which is where the work took place. place, not so much in what it sounded like.
Yes. And
Well, I mean, I wonder if the association that we have with the objects that create the sound are more with the objects than with the sound thus created. Like when we were working on the Symphony for dot matrix printers, we obviously had the choice to take the sound of the dot matrix printers and do what any self-respecting electronic musician would do with such a sound source, namely to go into the studio and sample them and then work with the samples at will. So by keeping the actual objects, the bodies that produce this noise present and integral to the piece, what we wind up basically sampling, not the sound, but the entire environment. And in that sense, sort of the material and the signification, if you like, of these objects is sort of maintained together.
And to be slightly less facetious, I'm going to now say no. But to add to that we had this amazing, witnessed this amazing interview with Panasonic, the sound group, and they were talking about their sort of attitude towards sound, and it was just great. I'm not really sure I'm going to be able to do the accent properly, but it's like, sound is like sushi. It is raw. No, sashimi. And I do think that that's actually relatively pertinent to the discussion, because I think that in all of the works that we do, the sound component is treated as very much as a physical experience and a perceptual experience. And my sort of training in phenomenology in architecture really made me want to focus on that kind of stuff. But at the same time, in the work that we did with the silo, for example, it's not actually terribly important, the experience of the sound per se, when you listen to the result, because it's always going to be terrible. It's always mediated by the internet, by the telephone, by this like loudspeaker compromise. It's never the actual experience of what it is to be inside the space, but it leads one to be able to imagine what the space must be like, because we have experienced similar spaces. So we're allowed to project our voice, if we like, or our sample, or our, Homer Simpson going do, into this tremendous space inside the silo, and test the space and imagine what it might be like. So yes and no.
A good answer. I think there'll be more yes and no's as we go along. But there's one in looking at the different versions of the dot matrix printer pieces. I saw one version of it many years ago in Berlin, and I remember it as being a very visceral, quite loud experience, really engaging on that. And part of the engagement that I had with it, and I think a lot of the people who experienced it, is the transformation of the objects, right? Part of the appeal is not simply the sound, but it's that they're coming from the subject, and you work very hard to make these sort of compositional arrangements with the objects. But that one of the essential qualities of it is really that sound of the printer, that in other contexts is more an annoyance than anything. I'm still, I don't know, but you guys, I'm still amazed. You go to an airport and they still print out stuff on dot matrix printers, and I realize that's an economic thing. It's not, has to do with utility. But that in your description of your presentation description of the quartet version of it involves a reference to sort of the workspace and the kind of an idea of perhaps the obsolescence of the human worker in the workspace. And those are two very different things. And this is kind of why I was asking this question, because that sound in that setting appears to have a significance that perhaps in the other settings, the dot matrix projects, that is a very different thing, that it doesn't exist. So I don't know, if that's an accurate reading of the piece?
I think it's a very accurate reading of the symphony series and the whole dot matrix set of works. But really, I mean, I think that the way that we work is we're very, very slow. Like we've been working for nearly 15 years to produce, I don't know, like 5 works total. I mean, there's been a bunch of minor works, but the way that we sort of approach these things is to take a starting point and then just completely obsess from that starting point and go outwards. So the initial gesture for the dot matrix printer projects was from this recording that I made of a binaural stereo recording of a typewriter. I showed it to Emmanuel. Emmanuel says, "Oh yeah, I've always wanted to do this project, dot matrix printers. I want to put them on stage and hit print and see what it sounds like." So we did that, and it was horrible. It was absolutely awful. But we soon realized that there was this other possibility that you have this transcription device, so therefore you can actually make a composition that will play back and always be the same. So you have this parallel between the orchestral structure or classical music structure, where you have a written piece of music and it's interpreted, and an instrument and a player and all of this stuff within this completely parallel universe of the office equipment. And then from there, it becomes an investigation about what the role of the worker is. Why are we subjected to these kinds of things? Why are we subjected to plastic forks? Why are we subjected to neon light? Why are we subjected to dot matrix printers? And the reason is all economic ones. That's what's possible to make now, and that's what's possible to sell to the consumer. So these things just become starting points for explorations of the sort of full potential.
Okay, that's good. And Zuriya, I wanted to ask you about some of the same things in response, particularly to the piece in the Oakland Plaza. And the reason I'm asking about that is that you're using bells, right? And bells in public spaces, of course, have a very long and complex social history. And it seemed like in that piece, you're using the ideas of the bell and the sound of the bell without attaching a specific inference to them. So that there's a kind of slippage, so that it's that in that context, when you hear the bell, it's an inaction and a kind of negation at the same time. Does that sound?
Yeah. All right, go from this side. Yes, so you're right, the bells is sort of a normal thing to hear in a downtown area, which is why they were chosen, because it's, not so upsetting to hear. But, once they go on for 5 minutes, maybe that's something a little bit different. And the signal of the bell, of course, is quite different for various auditors. Some people had this, thought of, the alarm when I was describing it, or, a call to service, or just the, kind of marker of the passage of time. And I wanted the possibility of all or none of these being what's conjured. So it's this familiar sound in a public square, but happening in a way that's maybe less familiar in this, which is, I think, achieved through the randomization. And it was also, I think, a piece that, importantly, there was no visual element either. And so there's nothing for someone to fix their gaze upon, and therefore also no real prescribed way of interacting with it or viewing it. And it could go unnoticed. And I think that became very important to the work and to making a possibility for interactions between the various audiences at this space. There, as I said, there were these art audiences who read about it happening and would come and sort of be the noticers in the space, and then people who are already using this public square for recreation or protest or whatever else was going on, who could be drawn in by the noticers or ignore it too, which was totally fine.
Yeah, there's an aspect of it which I don't know if you were thinking about when you were working on the piece, but which I thought of as you were describing it, which is that in part of the history of bells is that they used to serve as the delimiter for towns, right? That the acoustic horizon, the bell was in the middle of town because it would call people in, right? And that's not something that we really have very much anymore, certainly not in the middle of big cities like Oakland. And that was another case. I'm thinking about that. I don't know if that was part of your thinking when you were working on the piece, but in terms of how that square functions in Oakland, and particularly in the recent history with the Occupy movement, that there seemed to be a kind of reference to that the bell as a social marker and a physical marker and a spatial marker was very present.
For sure. The bells were, the locations were chosen because they radiated out from this square. And so, and they were also placed on buildings that were unremarkable, so not at City Hall, not at a church, and places where you might expect them. So as they created this sort of circle around the plaza, I wanted, again, to propose this plaza, which since Occupy has been a less comfortable place to be in a public group because it's more policed, as a center point and place to come together. And then once you're outside of that ring, you can hear the more individuated sounds of the bells, whereas inside you hear the kind of cacophony of sound.
Okay. And we'll open it up to questions in a bit, so start to prepare. And so I was also asking about this sort of duality, in part because your work, Tristan, comes out of a very strong musical background and musical composition. I know that there are plenty of people who work in sound that have a musical background that try and escape it one way or another, and they discover that there's a baggage that they can't quite get rid of. It's kind of stuck to them. I didn't get the sense in your description of it that was something you're trying to do, that you were looking at perhaps some of the properties of using sound in an expanded way, but without wanting to give up a lot of the things that naturally come with the sort of musical traditions that you studied.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I think of myself actually as very traditional in sort of the media I choose and the way I approach them, whether it's ink on paper and drawing or composed music on pages of sheets that musicians perform along with electronics. And even the electronics in those pieces, and those pieces are all through composed. There are no generative processes involved in the musical material themselves, even though algorithm is clearly a core part of the instrument of the microcontrollers that I'm using and the code behind them. It doesn't play any part in the writing of the music, even though I think about musical structures that will be represented well in simple information sort of structures. But yeah, I'm much more interested in finding ways to bring a certain kind of thinking, process-based kind of thinking, which is not even contemporary. I mean, I grew up listening to minimalism. I think those processes are the same that ones that I use. I'm more interested maybe in code and how, I mean, it's not a coincidence, I think, that minimalist music, the sort of simple structures that they were working with, are represented very, very beautifully and simply in code, like repetition, for instance. And so, yeah, in that sense, like, I think, in fact, I don't even try to stay away a lot from exotic instruments because I don't want to have any baggage of trying to step away from something. I think if in all of these pieces I'm trying to step away just a little tiny bit, and that might give me more of a platform to say something about these intersections or something. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. It's actually a good way to think of it. I was thinking about all your work in relation to the work of a couple of people, and particularly a few specific pieces. One was two of Jim Tenney's pieces. Jim Tenney's a Canadian composer, worked a lot with electronics, early electronics through the 60s, and then switched to mostly doing, I think, exclusive acoustic work after that. And the last of his electronic works was a piece called For and Rising from 1969. You guys are probably familiar with it. Yes? No? Okay. So it's a piece that is simply sine tones that sweep from sub-audio to above human hearing range. So one comes in, 12 seconds later another one comes in. So you hear it fading in and fading out. That's the complete structure. It goes on for about 12 minutes. And there's no... as you listen to it, it's hard to listen to because you're basically sounding like this continual sweep up. And there's no place to, it's a space that's purely sonic and has these very rigid definitions, but it has absolutely no place for the listener. You kind of are experience this thing, but it's like, no traction. Like when they tell kids about, resistance and traction and gravity, it's like you get rid of traction and you can't move. So it's that idea. And then, so that's a form of negation that's all about sound and all about some aspect of electronic and sort of musical sound. And then a few years later, he made a piece called Critical Band, which was for acoustic instruments and all focused the sound on a very narrow frequency range, so that you would hear a lot of overtones, and that this was, it was a way of thinking about listening to acoustic sounds, acoustic musical sounds, in a particular way that you would focus only on basically the sensory aspects of it. And it seemed, and in a lot of the work that you've done with the various instruments and the composition, it seems like you're using some of those same ideas, or there's some reference there, so that you're listening to a particular kind of space that you can't get simply with the acoustic instruments or with the electronic ones, but it's this space in between that the interest happens.
Yeah, sure. Those pieces sound great. I've been sort of waiting for the right time of my life to really dive into his music, so maybe now's the time. Yeah, no, totally. I think that my music has gotten more austere, more focused over time, but then weirdly branches out maybe in fighting, trying to fight that. But on the topic of range, working with one-bit sound the way I do, where all of the sound signals are fixed amplitude, so the ones are always a certain voltage and the zeros are always the reference to that, that higher frequency sound, like if you have 2 octaves of pitch, for instance, the one above is oscillating twice as often, it's moving twice as much air, it's also higher frequency, we perceive it as louder, and since I don't change the volume of the electronics, and I need to pair them with acoustic sound, it kind of boxes me into these narrow ranges automatically, something that I finally broke away from in a way with that big piano piece with 40 speakers surrounding the piano, because I could use multitude of fixed amplitude sources in order to, and they all settle on this one low tone, and it sounds really meaty and kind of great. It's something I wasn't able to do for those sort of technical, scientific reasons. That was kind of a tangent off of what you said.
I guess I was also thinking in terms of the one Tenny piece, the electronic piece, that moving back and forth in front of that wall is kind of like the enacting, because you can hear the glissando as you move. Sure. And that was, the first thing I thought was like, oh yeah, now here's that space in that other piece that doesn't exist. Like it's made it happen. I guess...
Grounding.
Yeah. And Surya, I was going to ask you about, since you don't really talk about the piece here, I don't know how much you want to say or whether you want us just to go in and experience it, but to me it had some of those same properties, that it was all about moving through the space, placing yourself in it, listening carefully, and then especially sort of listening carefully in relation to the objects that are in the space.
So I guess I could talk a little bit about the work, which was commissioned by the gallery and made for this space. So I think it would work in another white gallery space. And as you say, it is about the situation of the auditor as she moves through the space, rather than I guess the sound that's coming through the speakers that I'm using, which is monolithic, but as it's perceived in the space, is anything but, hopefully. And what my interest in this space, and when I got to the gallery, is I wanted to create some sort of architecture within the space that wouldn't use walls, or create an image of the space for the viewer that wouldn't be dependent on what exists there within this rectilinear building, and to have a space that sort of like changes in space and time and is influenced not only by the viewer's own body in the space, but by the presence of other bodies. So even if you're still and someone else is moving, you can sort of hear them moving through that space. So the vessels in the space were sort of also meant to reference the body of the viewer, which is why they're included, but similar to the speakers, which are all producing the same sine tone, they are tuned to the same pitch if they were to be played. But the vessels, again, they are containers and receivers, and I think also perhaps feminine in their form and reflect an exaggerated form of the female body, and are certainly anti-phallic in that they do contain. So they're meant to be sort of surrogate bodies in this space, and the work is maybe meant to be in contrast to the kind of rectilinear Philip Johnson building, and propose something that's slightly different.
Those of us who spend a lot of time in this building really appreciate that. I want to open it up to questions. So if anyone has.
I'm just curious how all of you see feeling in terms of the installation versus the sound work, and considering the uses of various technologies, how you between 200 years in the future when maybe these technologies don't exist anymore, would they simply be seen as a limitation, or would they change as I'm just wondering how important the experience of the space is as it is now for the work, and like, as technology changes, how if they envision the pieces existing with different technology, if it's like 200 years from now, or if they were just to exist with be a documentation of their current installation.
Maybe I'll say quickly. I think I don't know so much about my work is not site specific per se, although the room that it's in, of course, is quite important to the experience. But I like diversity of space. The piece that's here, the 1,500 speakers, 25-foot wall. Maybe the one thing I could say about it is that they're all ranged on a flat plane, specifically because there is, like, to make it so that there is no specific optimal viewing, listening location. Like they could be, for instance, in a hyperbolic arrangement or something, so that there would be one point in the space that's the ideal listening point where you can hear them all at the same volume. But because they're in a plane, in order to hear them all at the same volume, you'd have to be infinitely far away, so that your kind of distance approaches the same for each speaker. In terms of like longevity of pieces, that's kind of open for me at least, but I do like the fact that technology is part of the real world and that it rusts, its kind of materials fall apart and stuff. And my feeling towards I don't like the idea of a document standing in for the actual piece, but I do like the document kind of referencing the piece. They're not one and the same. One of the worst things I ever saw, I thought, this might just be me, is a Nam June Paik retrospective. Maybe all of the exhibitions of his work are like this now, but all the TV pieces had like LCD screens inside them in the old TV enclosures, and like not even really convincingly done. So the color space is all wrong. It was kind of a disaster. So that's what I don't want to be doing.
Yeah, I think I feel similarly about documentation as you, and really impressed by artists like Maria Nordum, who doesn't allow documentation, or it's something that's totally different from the work, and kind of its own piece. And then as far as longevity, the glass vessels will probably survive, or you can keep going to the thrift store in 100 years, hopefully, and find similar things.
Hopefully there's glass around.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, I think the apocalypse is probably coming before that, so. That's all right. But no, but yeah, and the speakers. I mean, this is a piece that I think would be very difficult to document in a way that would, really represent the experience. So I think the documentation has to become its own piece.
Although our works are usually not site-specific, they're always very much technology-specific, and I think that I'm okay with the fact that eventually these things will break. They're surprisingly robust. Quite a few of the technologies we work with are still going strong, much far after their projected expiry date, but they're not going to last for 200 years. And I think that's okay, because really what we're doing is intervening in the present historical moment in terms of our relationship with technology, right? Like when we made the printer piece, we were addressing it to a public that remembered the sounds of dot matrix printers, and we were like, we're rejigging the meaning of a known phenomenon. Well, you play this piece now, I mean, people of a younger generation have no idea what these things even sounded like, unless they really pay attention at airports, because that's the one place where you still will find them, for the moment anyway. So from the moment that that original reference to a technology is lost, the purpose of the work is no longer fully served. As for documentation, I mean, when we do document the work, we do our utmost to turn it into a piece in its own right. So there's a standalone audio release, like a CD vinyl release of a couple of the pieces, and those will continue to exist, but they're another thing again from the installations.
I just wanted to add to that just one thing that we think about these things as being apart, these technologies as being apart from the rest of the history of art, and I'm sort of very much against that position, because if you look at the history of painting, you have this moment in painting where somebody invents a new way of making blue. A new blue suddenly becomes available on the market because somebody's like importing like beetle shells from here to there, and all of a sudden blue becomes trendy, and all of these artists adopt it. And then from this moment on, we have this color through basically technical innovation available to the artist. So I see very much the adoption of the latest technology being part and parcel of the process of making contemporary art, whenever contemporary happens to be. It's just that now we've got to this position where things are being invented at such a rapid rate and disappearing at such a rapid rate that people born within the space of 10 years may or may not have been exposed to these kinds of technologies, like Emmanuel was saying about the dot matrix printers. But I think that actual that fact is a very important thing to actually be engaging with as an artist. So yes, this stuff is going to be obsolete, but that's why we're doing it, because obsolescence has become so important to our society.
And we have time for one more question. Sorry.
I really have a lot of questions, but one that's kind of really bugging me, and that is, do you each have like a physicist on speed dial, or do you sort of fancy yourself as sound scientists?
I do not fancy myself as a sound scientist, but I have lots of friends who are engineers, and that's really helpful, I think. There's been a number of projects that have worked so well in my head, and then when I thought of describe them and taking them to the physical world, realized that it was against the laws of physics. So it's helpful to have people to run things by or test things out with.
For me, it was like I just read as much as I can about physics, in particular, quantum mechanics and everything. And I think that thinking about that stuff has led to a lot of this stuff, and also in particular early computer science work, like Kurt Gödel and Alan Turing and stuff like that, was really, really meaningful to me. I'd actually love to have a sort of scientist on speed dial. I had the pleasure of meeting Seth Lloyd last year. He was a quantum computation expert at MIT, and I really hope to talk to him more about this kind of stuff.
We actually have several on speed dial.
Hell.
Yeah, from basically from the get-go, when we first started working together, we knew immediately that we needed outside help. But that was really because, I mean, I think that we view the practice that we have as a collective effort. We regard ourselves as being artistic directors of a larger team. The first guy that we met is he designed the lottery network for Jamaica and the satellite telephone communication system for sub-Saharan Africa. And he's like, yeah, sure, I think I can help you. That's great. And computer programmers and mathematicians and basically anybody that we can get our hands on who's able to inform these processes to try and translate from what we're trying, where was our starting point to where we want to go. And I think that's really amazing. That's really fascinating, is allowing us to engage with the technological process where it actually happens before it gets into consumer hands is really quite a privilege.
Well, thanks to all the artists for providing such wonderful work for us and for sharing your thoughts and ideas. We'll head outside where we can continue the conversation, and I would also encourage you guys to all come back sometime when it's not a reception so you can really hear the works in precise detail. So thanks.
Thanks.